Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 56, and my name is Janet Szabo. I will be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I'm recording this a little bit early this week just because my husband has had a cold and I'm feeling a little bit punky. I have a bit of a scratchy throat and I want to get this recorded while I still have a decent voice to do so. So that's why I'm recording today. You don't know what day it is. I'll tell you it's Halloween. Usually I record on a Friday or a Monday, but I want to make sure that this sounds okay. And today's episode is a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I'm going to be talking about sewing after the apocalypse. If you've listened to any of the previous episodes, you know that my husband and I live on 7 acres in northwest Montana. We raise chickens and pigs, and I have a very large garden, and I can most of what I grow or preserve it. We do a good job of feeding ourselves off the land, and while I wouldn't call us preppers necessarily in the sense of people who are hoping for the end of the world, we are set up here so that should anything happen, we can be fairly self-sufficient. And part of the reason we did that, I started doing it when we moved here over 30 years ago, just because we're a good half an hour, 45 minutes from town, depending on the time of year and the amount of traffic. And I can't just be running out to get little things here and there at the store. So I learned to stock up and to create what we call a deep pantry, meaning that I can pull out things to make meals without having to leave the house. And believe me, in the winter when there's a ton of snow outside and I don't feel like taking 2 hours to go to town, that's a huge thing. One of my college friends said to us right after the pandemic started that we were the only 2 people that she knew who were actually prepared for a pandemic. I have expanded that to my sewing, and I have what I would call a deep pantry with regard to my sewing supplies, because when I get hit with the urge to make something, again, I want to be able to go shopping in my stash and pull out what I need rather than having to make a special trip to Joann Fabrics. I do belong to some homesteading groups online, and we've joked about this in the past, that while the prepper people are running around learning about how to butcher animals and make fire and cook over a rocket mass heater and do all these other things and learn how to shoot their guns and things like that, that they always seem to forget that they're going to need to have clothing, because after the apocalypse, no one wants to see you naked. And your clothing is eventually going to wear out. So what are your contingency plans if, for some reason, we have a major supply chain disruption and you can't get socks or underwear for 2 years? Again, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. We joke about it, but I think it's a topic worth talking about, so that's why I'm going to devote today's podcast to talking about sewing after the apocalypse. And we're going to cover quite a few things. I'm going to talk about equipment, and I'm going to talk about supplies, and I'm going to talk about skills. And if this is something that you're even remotely interested in, then hopefully by the end of the podcast, I will have provided some guidance and some ideas for you to pursue on your own. So we'll go ahead and get started, and I'm going to start with the obvious, which is the equipment. And in many ways, this is easy because people were sewing even before their houses were electrified. People had treadle sewing machines, and treadle sewing machines are still pretty ubiquitous. You can find them often at estate sales or thrift stores. Unfortunately, and it kind of breaks my heart to see this happen, people have taken the machines out of the treadle bases and converted the treadle bases into wash stands, or they've taken the irons off of the table and they've made stair railings out of them. I've seen lots of different things done with treadle bases, and it does break my heart sometimes because some of the more rare treadle bases, like the industrial treadle bases, are hard to come by. So if you find a treadle base, even if the top has been repurposed into something else, you can often take that top off and replace it with a top into which you can drop a sewing machine. As long as the wheel is there and the pedals there and the irons are in good shape, you should be able to use that treadle base. Obviously, the Singer treadle bases are going to be the easiest ones to find because the Singer machines were the most popular and there are still a lot of them around. The nice thing is that a lot of other machines can be used in Singer treadle bases. Other machine manufacturers made their machines to the same specifications, if that's the right way to say it, so that their machines fit the opening in a Singer treadle base. A lot of them fit the opening in a regular sewing machine base too, a sewing machine cabinet, which is really nice. I have 2 Necky machines that are in Singer treadle bases. One is my Necky Industrial. It is in a Singer Industrial treadle base, and the other one is a Necky Asperia, and it is in a Singer Domestic treadle base. The difference between those 2 bases is the size of the wheel, the size of the pedal. The industrial treadle bases are just a little bit beefier. The Singer Industrial treadle base that I have my Necky Industrial machine in came locally. I found it locally. A woman about 5 miles from me was selling a Singer 78-1 sewing machine in a treadle base. And at the time I bought the machine, I got it for a steal. I think she only wanted $75. At the time I bought it, I really didn't need the 78-1, which now I'm sorry I sold it, but I sold it to a friend of mine who has an upholstery business, and he loves it. And I joke that we share custody of it because for a while, if I needed it, he would let me come up and get the head and bring it back here and put it in the original treadle base and go ahead and use it for a while, and then I would take it back to him. He is not interested in selling it back to me, unfortunately. The Singer 78-3, 78-2, and 78-1, I think there's 3 of them. They're all needle feed machines, and they're great machines. They do wonderful work on leather and upholstery, and he loves using it on upholstery. I used it for bag making. I have a needle feed machine now. I've got a modern Juki 1541, so I don't need the 78 as much as I used to. But if you ever see one, snatch it up. They're great machines. Singer manufactured a lot of different styles of domestic treadle bases, and one of the pages that you're going to want to visit is called ismax.net. It's the International Sewing Machine Collectors Society, and they have just a ton of information about vintage sewing machines of all manufacturers, but especially of Singer. You can look up the serial number of your machine and find the date that it came off the factory floor, if it's a Singer. You can also look up the different Singer models. You can look up the different Singer cabinet styles. It's a great place to poke around and get additional information if you have any interest in vintage sewing machines. I'm going to be talking mostly about vintage sewing machines here, but I should note that if you go to Lehmans.com, Lehmans.com, Lehmans is a hardware store in Ohio. My mother and I visited there a few weeks ago. They carry in their catalog a treadle sewing machine that's made by Janome. And obviously, because they cater to a lot of the Amish in that area who don't have electricity in their homes, that Janome modern sewing machine set up as a treadle is something that's available for purchase. So that's a little bit about treadle bases. I'm going to talk a little bit more about treadling, but we need to talk about also the machines. So a lot of machines can be treadled even if they weren't set up that way originally. The Necky Supernovas can be put into a treadle cabinet and treadled, even though they were never sold as a treadle machine. As long as you can get a machine into a cabinet and have the flywheel, the hand wheel, line up over the flywheel of the treadle mechanism and put a belt on it, you can basically turn any sewing machine into a treadle machine. You'll probably need to clean up the head of the sewing machine. And please don't use soap and water on a sewing machine, because what will happen is the water will cause those decals to silver. And suddenly you will find yourself with a machine that has silver decals instead of gold ones. And it doesn't affect the operation of the machine, obviously, but it does affect the value and the appearance of the machine. So when you get a vintage sewing machine, wipe it down with clear sewing machine oil, lily white or whatever you would use to oil a sewing machine. Wipe it down liberally with a cotton ball soaked in sewing machine oil. That will take all of the dirt and the grease off without damaging the decals. A lot of those machines also have a buildup of grime and grease inside, and rather than try to take the whole machine apart, if you have a mechanical bent and you want to try to do that, by all means, knock yourself out. I'd prefer not to do that. I always worry about getting them back together and using all of the screws and bolts. So what you can do is a couple of different things. There is a product called Blue Creeper, which is very popular in the vintage sewing machine world. And you can liberally squirt Blue Creeper. It's a penetrating oil into the mechanism of the sewing machine and give it a couple of hours to kind of soak in and get into all of the nooks and crannies. And then you can very carefully get into the spots that you can see with an old toothbrush or a pipe cleaner if you're careful, and scrub out all of the dirt and grime. One of the things that I really like to use, although it's getting harder to find, is the non-pumice goop or Gojo hand cleaner. It comes with a caveat. Test it on the decals in an inconspicuous spot. I have had it take off some Singer decals. That was on the older or the newer machines that were made in the 60s. It works fine on the older machines, but test it just to be sure. If you get the non-pumice goop, you can scoop it up literally by the handfuls and rub it all over the mechanisms of the sewing machine, get it inside the nooks and crannies, and let it liquefy, and put a towel underneath the machine, and it literally will pull all of the dirt and grease with it as the goop liquefies. That's a cleaning method that has worked really well for me in the past. You can, if you're careful, take off what I call the jewelry, which is all the shiny bits or the formerly shiny bits, and polish those up either by hand or with a Dremel tool or something similar. Once you've gotten the machine as clean as you can get it, oil it. Again, Blue Creeper makes a sewing machine oil. That's what I use, but any good quality sewing machine oil, clear sewing machine oil, will do the best job for your machine. Be liberal with it. Those machines want oil, and you want to have oil on any metal to metal moving parts. If your machine has gears, you can use grease on the gears as well, although I have been told that white lithium grease is not a good thing to use as it tends to harden over time. I usually use a sewing machine grease that's kind of like a Vaseline type thing. It's not Vaseline, but it looks like Vaseline. It's clear. So now you have your machine and you have your treadle base. You need something to get the power from the treadle base up to the machine. And for that, I use a leather belt. You can still get leather belting for treadle machines. I will try to find some suppliers on the internet and list those in the show notes. For a domestic machine, you want a belt that's 1/4 of an inch in diameter. For my industrial machine, I have a belt that is 3/8 of an inch in diameter. I will tell you that getting that belt on the machine is a little bit tricky. You have to get the length correct, trim the ends of the belt so that they butt up against each other, and then take an awl or some other kind of sharp object. Sometimes I use a finishing nail and drive a hole through each end of the belt. And what I have found works really well to secure the two ends together after you've got the holes in is to take a large paper clip, one of the jumbo paper clips, and unbend it. And that weight of wire seems to work really well. So you want to run it through each of the holes and then bend it back on itself. So it looks kind of like a staple holding the two ends of the belt butted up against each other. And that should be smooth enough. You're going to get a little bit of a bump while you're treadling, but it shouldn't interfere with the sewing process, and you're good to go. I am sure that there are some videos on YouTube that demonstrate this, and again, if I can find any, I will link to them in the show notes. I just want to make a quick note here about the hand wheel on the sewing machine. If you are lucky enough to find a vintage sewing machine that's got one of the large hand wheels on it, I think that you will find that treadling is a little bit easier with that kind of hand wheel. There are a couple of things that factor into how a treadle sewing machine operates, and one is the gear ratio. So the ratio between the size of the hand wheel on the sewing machine and the size of the flywheel on the treadle base, because you're going to get a specific number of rotations of the hand wheel on the sewing machine for every rotation of the treadle wheel. The same is true of a spinning wheel, which is why I'm kind of familiar with this, because I had to, when I was learning how to spin, I had to learn about gear ratios or wheel ratios. If the hand wheel diameter is much smaller than the treadle wheel diameter, you're going to get many more revolutions per second or per turn of the treadle wheel. If it's larger, you're going to get fewer revolutions. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing that you need to consider is the mass of the hand wheel. The older Singer machines had much bigger and heavier hand wheels, and I prefer those. The mass is such that once you get the wheel going, it's much easier to keep it going. Inertia. An object in motion wants to stay in motion. I really only have one, well, maybe two if I consider the Singer 78, but I had another Singer sewing machine that I'm really kind of sorry that I sold. It was a head that I found in an antique store locally, and it had what are called the pheasant decals on it. And I cleaned that machine head up and I put it into a really ornate treadle base. And I kid you not, the first time I sewed on that machine, it was like the machine was singing. It was so happy to be sewing again. And I'm really sorry that I sold that machine. It went to somebody that I think treasures it, but I'd like to have it back. I have not had another machine since then that's done the same thing. Treadling takes a little bit of practice. Don't be surprised if you sit down and the first time you try to treadle a sewing machine, you stop and the machine wants to roll backwards. It takes a little bit of practice to learn the control and how to manage your feet on the treadle base. Some people like to pedal with both feet. Some people only like to pedal with one foot. So you need to try a couple of different techniques and see what works best for you. Once you get into a rhythm, it's very relaxing and very soothing, and you have good control over your sewing. That's part of the reason I put my industrial necky into a treadle base, because when I use it to sew bags, I can sew stitch by stitch if I need to. The only other comment I would make about a treadle machine is it's always a good practice to slip the belt off of the treadle base wheel or the machine wheel, you just want to take that tension off of the belt so that it doesn't stretch out as quickly. And depending on how much you use your machine, you probably will have to change the length of the belt every couple of months just to make it a little bit shorter so that you get the proper amount of tension on it. What if you don't have room for a treadle machine? And not everybody does. Some people travel in an RV. Some people have tiny houses. Not everybody's got the space to devote to a treadle machine. And in that case, I would look at retrofitting a sewing machine with a hand crank unless you are one of the lucky few who finds a sewing machine with an original hand crank assembly on it. I have one. I found it in an antique store in Maryland, but there are aftermarket hand crank assembly kits that you can buy and bolt onto a machine. In that case, what you get is a machine that is portable and allows you to sew in a lot of different places. I have put aftermarket hand crank assemblies on Singer 15 models, on Singer 66 models. I've even put them on a FAF 30, which is a straight stitch FAF vintage sewing machine. That one I had to buy specially made, and I'm not sure if the guy's still making them or not. Again, if I can find the link, I'll put it up on the show notes. The one machine that I really, really like as a hand crank, I call her Plain Jane because I picked her up in a thrift store and it appeared that she had been spray painted black at some point, but spray painted black and then with the Singer decal replaced. And if you look very carefully at the bed of the machine underneath the black paint, you can see the imprint of the Singer Red Eye decals, which were only ever used on Singer 66 machines. So I think that machine probably came off the factory floor as a Red Eye model, and for whatever reason, at some point, somebody painted it black. I do know that during World War II, when the Singer factories were converted over to making munitions, fewer sewing machines were available, and a lot of the older ones were spray painted black. So it's possible that happened during that time period. She's very plain now. I'm sure she was beautiful as a Red Eye model, but I put a hand crank on her, and she's the machine that I'll sometimes take out onto the porch during the summer to sew quilt blocks on. You have to watch with some of those models because they don't sit flush on a table. One of them will. I can't remember if it's the 15 or the 66. One of them won't, and the ones that won't, a lot of times you'll have to find some kind of base to set it in to use it as a hand crank so that it's not rocking on the table. When I was ordering the aftermarket hand crank assemblies for my machines, I was able to get them from some independent sewing machine suppliers, but I just checked and now I see that even Walmart is selling them. So they come from China. The quality is not great. The quality is not nearly what it was on the original hand cranks, but they do the job. And if you're worried about not being able to sew when the electricity is out, a hand crank is a great way to go. Again, it does, like a treadle, take a little bit of practice because you can only control the fabric with your left hand. You have to be turning the hand crank with your right hand. So it takes a little bit of practice, but once you get it under control, you'll be able to sew on it. I should note that the hand crank assemblies mount onto the machine using the motor boss, which is the part of the machine casting that the electric motors bolted onto. The very oldest Singers don't have motor mounts for obvious reasons because they were produced before there was electricity and the motor mounts just weren't cast as part of the machine head. So anything I think older than like 1910 probably won't have a motor mount on it, and you won't be able to bolt the aftermarket assembly to it. And I have managed to use up most of this episode just talking about machines. So I think I may hold off on doing the other part of this for the next episode. And that will also give those of you who might have some questions the opportunity to let me know. I will tell you that going down the vintage sewing machine rabbit hole is a dangerous journey because you could end up with a lot of machines. I have a lot of machines. I use many of my machines, but not all of them certainly, and some of them are taking up space. But I figure if there ever is an apocalypse and people need treadle sewing machines, I'm going to have some that I can sell, and I don't think that's a bad thing. And if the apocalypse never happens, I get the joy of sewing on a treadle machine even when we don't have electricity. Thank you for the feedback that I've been getting. I really appreciate knowing what resonates with my listeners, what you like, what you don't like, and what you want to hear more of. So please feel free to email me at janet@janetzabo.com or leave a comment on the show notes page or use the fan mail feature on Buzzsprout, which appears now that I can reply to. So I will try to reply to those who send me fan mail to Buzzsprout. If you would like to see the show notes pages, they are at the podcast website at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is at www.janetzabo.com with links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website, as well as the blog where I write about life in Montana and what I'm sewing these days. We actually had our first significant snow of the season today, so I will be staying inside from now on. No more gardening, and I will have plenty of time for sewing. I've been working on a few projects, and I'll probably talk about those more in detail next week. Again, if you have questions or comments, or you want to be a guest on the podcast, or you have some ideas for guests for the podcast, let me know, and I will do my best to make it happen. So until next time, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.